Yeah, we're not a spring chicken anymore. We're sort of like finding ourselves at the end of college mode, I guess, or not college. So hi, you can learn a lot about yourself and about your community in a time of crisis. I have three kids now. When I gave birth to my twin girls in 2011, I had a pretty rough multi-month recovery period. And in that time, our friends around our city and around the country stepped up in profound, often hilarious and inspiring ways that really helped us get through. One friend who was a vegetarian cooked meals for us, taught themselves to cook meat and made dinner for us every other night for 3 months. Another friend gave up her house so that my mother and mother-in-law could be nearby to help us get through. And I think if you think about your own life and think about various kinds of crises you've come through, you'll remember moments in which your community totally inspired and surprised you by how it showed up and how it stepped up. That's when we learn what our communities are capable of, is through times of crisis. And friends, we are in a crisis. Collectively, our democracy is in a state of acute crisis. To be real clear, we've been in a state of crisis for a long time. We've been in a state of underlying chronic and interlocking crises, ranging from big money distorting our politics to the kind of tenacious grip of racism in America. And that actually, those crises paved the way, I think, to the point of our last speaker, for the state of acute crisis of Trump and Trumpism. Actually, here's the alternate title I had for my talk today. Point being, it took a lot for us to get into this total mess, and there's no one simple silver bullet, no tech tool, no artificial intelligence solution, no single 2020 candidate that's going to be able to get us out of it. We together face a massive organizing challenge. That's our project right now. And I really believe that the next 6 months, including the hugely important midterm elections, are our single best opportunity that we're gonna get as a democracy to decisively interrupt the accelerating multi-front crisis that we're caught in. We need to interrupt not only the current attacks on our communities, we need to stave off a full-blown descent into authoritarianism, and we need to make a real leap forward into fully inhabiting the dream of this democracy, the dream that we've never yet lived into but will. So I'm real confident that we're going to rise to the challenge, actually. I spend every single day reading the darkest headlines imaginable with many of us, if you've stayed tuned in to your news feed. And I'm feeling optimistic. I think the vast public is very clearly not on the side of the would-be autocrats that are currently running the country. And I see us learning in real time right now about how to show up in powerful new ways. Through this crisis, I see us building for the longer-term transformation and reinvigoration of this democracy. So, in this time of crisis, we are learning what we are capable of, and we are learning and modeling, I think, some inspiring new practices of resistance and resilience that will move us forward. So let's talk about what that is. This is really the core of my thing I want to be in conversation with you here about. We are learning through this crisis that we need civic resistance, and we need what I would call small d democratic, yes, we're progressive, but small d, democratic resilience to meet this moment. Resistance and resilience. That is modes of resistance that build the power of organizing and community institutions, and resilience that sustains us through the inevitable challenges and setbacks because we are smartly networked, we've distributed power across many nodes, and because we're in genuine human relationship with each other. So as I talk about this to sort of ground in the organizational context I come from, and there's some amazing Move On staff here that you should connect with while you're in this space. Move On is proudly progressive. Our vision is to build a country and a world where everyone can thrive, one that's marked by equality, sustainability, justice, and love. We believe that economic justice and racial justice and other forms of social justice are mutually reinforcing and not contradictory, which is an important, I think, ideological place to hold in this moment. We try to do two things very well. We fight for diplomacy as we fight for things like diplomacy with Iran, or extending healthcare access to millions of Americans, or passing the DREAM Act, or in this moment, defending investigations into Trump and his campaign. We organize, we build leadership at the grassroots level, and we mobilize. We pick specific moments and campaigns, and we focus our broad network on taking action together. And we use technology to accelerate both of those strategies. So that's our context. How do we resist, and what are we learning about what works in resisting? Sustained civic resistance is essential to get us through the vicious attacks and state of acute crisis that we are in. So that might sound obvious. There's been a lot of talk about the resistance for the last 18 months, but I've also sometimes sensed this almost wistful hope that, for example, the courts could just step in as the adult in the room and save us. If you've ever sensed that, right? Of course, the courts have a key role to play, but the courts are not our savior here. The courts can be, and already are being in front of our eyes, like while we're in this room, politicized. They will be politicized over time. And other institutions are not stopping the madness that we are caught in. Remember when people thought that the Republican Party would stop Trump? Yeah, that didn't happen. We need many strategies in the age of Trump and Trumpism: legal, cultural, corporate, narrative, certainly electoral. But I want to be real clear that the rest of our strategies won't work. They won't stick if we aren't deeply invested in organizing people in communities. We need to be invested specifically in nationally networked organizing that is connected to authentic, diverse, local leadership and grounded in healthy institutions that weave us together in working for justice and dignity for everyone. That's the civic part of civic resistance. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about institutions in a bit, but institutions are real important in this crisis. So I see 4 key qualities that we need our resistance organizing to have. First, it must be leaderful. So we need to be very serious about supporting multiracial, multi-generational, locally rooted individuals and groups of leaders. There's a Move On member whose name is Lynn Hughes, who's based in Mount Lebanon, Pennsylvania. She held a house party in January 2017. And I love what she told the local paper later, which was, I figured, I have a house, I'll have a party. House party. And she expected 5 people, 25 people showed up. They used the materials and the calls to action from national networks like Move On, like Indivisible. They organized, they built local leadership, they organized through the kind of flashpoint moments, the big headline moments, and the quieter stretches too. And they formed an organization called Mount Lebanon Rise Up. And a year after that first house party, I have a house, I'll have a party, they helped play an essential role in electing Connor Lamb to the House of Representatives in the special election that happened in their area. There are so many people around the country who are like Lynn, who are ready to step up and are stepping up in these inspiring ways and will keep doing so if they're properly supported. We also need organizing which is truly scaled and networked on a national level and deeply localized and personalized. So in the fight to defend the Affordable Care Act last year, we saw unbelievable scale. So Move On members alone made over 1 million phone calls to Congress and other targets to defend healthcare access. And with our partners, we helped bring hundreds of thousands of people to town halls around the country. And so much of that work was also deeply localized and personalized. So there was the woman who stopped Susan Collins at a 4th of July parade in Eastport, Maine, and forced her to look in the eyes of her daughter with cystic fibrosis and said, this is who you need to be voting for. Because we went so deep locally and because we were so excellently networked nationally and strategic nationally, we were powerful enough to do the impossible, which was to defeat what was Trump's stated top priority, the thing he was going to achieve on day 1 of taking office. We can be that powerful. Third, powerful civic resistance needs to be fundamentally connected to institutions and to our core values reinforced through those institutions. So we need, it might seem a little, not ironic, but but a little odd to say that to disrupt power, we need powerful institutions, but it's absolutely true. In part because I think there's this conceptual mistake that happens in this kind of acute era where people think that the iconic mobilizations of the resistance era just kind of happen. Maybe the internet did it, or maybe it was some resistance fairy. Friends, there is no resistance fairy. There is only us. We're it. There's us and there's our institutions. And so, for example, with the Muslim ban airport protests, which folks may remember, including the spark for the wave across the country, which began here at JFK Airport, those protests, which were so beautiful, so inspiring, so important for setting the tone of this new era we were entering, were profoundly enabled by groups including the New York Immigration Coalition and Make the Road New York and the Arab American Association of New York and elected officials like Jerry Nadler, who rushed, I believe he was the first or one of the first elected officials to rush to the airport at JFK at the moment that the protests first sparked. So we know, and I should say also that many of the organizations and institutions that stepped up and enabled that moment had themselves Muslims in positions of leadership, and so therefore were able to take the lead quickly and appropriately, right? So we know that community organizations and institutions are essential in producing those moments, but they're also essential to make use of what comes out of them, to make the most of those moments when they occur. So I really love Zeynak Tufekci, who's spoken in this space in the past. I love her point that protests are just a signal of our underlying potential power and not the power itself, right? So for the power itself, you gotta build and sustain excellent institutions. That's part of the equation. So I joined my local church in Evanston, Illinois, where I live, after Trump was elected, because I think that's true even on the hyper-local level. And I've been so proud to see our church offer sanctuary to a woman who would be murdered or could be murdered if she was deported back to El Salvador. Our democracy, our communities, our movements need healthy organizing and community institutions at every level, local, regional, and national, to survive this era, to thrive, and to win. Finally, our civic resistance must be built on humility and openness and real trust in grassroots voices. So we need to be listening to, not just listening to, but elevating, centering, giving power to the folks who have a better idea of what we should do or a better way of saying what needs to be said than the ostensible professionals. So our systems and plans need to be able to hear and capture and adapt to what's bubbling up. So one example, MoveOn's Political Action Committee is running a video persuasion program where our members record themselves talking about why they're voting the way they're voting. And we then use careful analytics to find persuasion effects and identify the people who will be persuaded by each video. I've been so happily inspired and blown away by some of the pairings that we are finding. So the older white man in Pennsylvania who turns out to be persuasive to conservative young white fathers when he's talking about the government that his children will inherit. Or the middle-aged black MoveOn member mom in Virginia who was persuasive to conservative rural white women in talking about caring about her family's safety in the aftermath of Nazis marching in Charlottesville. So none of those messages would have been scripted by a professional consultant in DC. The way they said it, the people that they turned out to connect with, and that's precisely the point, right? So authenticity travels. We kind of know this intuitively in the age we're living in, but there's also this ocean of creativity and ingenuity and heart in the grassroots of this democracy. And we need smart resistance organizing structures that will allow that brilliance to bubble up and find a home. When you break it down like that, it sounds pretty simple. We're just going to resist in a way that's leaderful. We're going to be rooted locally and networked nationally. We're going to be grounded in institutions. We're going to be fundamentally grassroots. But we know things aren't always smooth, and we know this work is going to be it's going to take a while. Remember that first slide of all the things I think we basically need to do, my alternate talk? So while we are resisting the acute attacks we face today, we also need to be building our resilience on every level, from the individual to the movement level. So what do we mean by that? We need to be able to collectively bounce back and reroute at a movement level when we come through terrible defeats, which we will and we already have. We need to be building human relationship and mutuality and webs of real shared power and accountability, including preparing for the worst in a way that builds our power, even if the worst doesn't happen. Feels hard to say that. Sometimes it feels like the worst is happening every day, but a new worst. So the Trump is not above the law network is a really interesting case in point about this. So MoveOn and a number of partners helped to build this rapid response network defending the Mueller investigation. 400,000 people have signed up, have affirmatively come to the site and signed up to attend one of 800 local volunteer-led events in case the independent investigations into Trump are ever hobbled. And the interesting thing is, but that's amazing. I know that we will be there on the day after any such triggering event happens. Let's hope it never happens. But the really interesting thing is that the organizing of that network has expanded and strengthened our coalitions nationally and locally. People will say, you'll see sort of coming into the organizers working on this network, people saying, I don't agree with MoveOn on anything else, but if that guy's fired, I'll be there the next day. So we've seen that we've developed and supported local leaders who are now doing proactive work on a range of fronts. It's like our emergency prep work has built our small d democratic muscle, if that makes sense. Okay, so 2, to achieve resilience, we need to share power and resources while working hard to maintain smart alignment and coordination. So the great civil rights hero Bayard Rustin has this quote that I've returned to at various points, that if we desire a society which is democratic, democracy must be a means as well as an end. I take that as a really useful challenge. It's a useful provocation. That we have to have institutions and movements which are profoundly representative and also accountable. So among other things, let's move real resources. So when MoveOn had a spike in small donor fundraising in 2017, we directly granted or bundled over $5 million to other organizations in the resistance. We're not a foundation. Right? Yeah, it was awesome. We were very proud of it. We're not a foundation, but if we can do that, others can too. We believe that we have to be building others up, not just those inside our narrow institutional walls. We're more resilient collectively if we are all strong and healthy across organizations. So third, we're going to need a variety of models, from radically decentralized to more tightly directed. So the Movement for Black Lives' network explicitly doesn't require ideological, policy, or strategic agreement across chapters. The organization, or the network Cosecha, runs this decentralized network of leaders who operate independently. People's Action, a community organizing network, has state affiliates that federate with the national network. And there's many other models that are more or less decentralized. I would argue that all have their role to play in helping us survive and get through this era. Finally, to build and sustain our democratic resilience through this time of acute crisis, let's learn from what's working and do more of it. And let's learn from what's not working and do less of it. Sounds simple, but it's kind of hard, turns out. So here's something that has worked in the last 18 months in organizing effective resistance. Giving people an adaptable, replicable, clear container for action, and asking a lot of them and empowering them to run with it and adapt it as useful in that community context. The Working Families Party helped to kickstart something called Resist Trump Tuesdays, which was Resist Trump Tuesdays means on Tuesdays, you resist Trump. You show up at your local congressional office and you hold a protest. There are places where those Resist Trump Tuesday events are still going 18 months later, and they've literally turned into a platform for local connection and planning and action. So that's something that's worked. Let's adapt when things are not working. Here's an example of that. In the 6 weeks from roughly mid-April to the end of May, MoveOn saw a significant dip in response rates across a number of channels where we do our organizing. And we realized what was happening, which was people needed a change of pace from the daily drumbeat of outrage, right? We need to remember that no one can sustain outrage all the time, even when everything is outrageous. You cannot live in outrage day in and day out. So here's what worked. we actually had to change gear and find ways for our members to connect in ways which were also joyful. Offering free ice cream did not hurt either. So that's what we need for resilience. We're going to plan and prepare in a way that builds our power, even if the new worst doesn't come to pass. We're going to share resources. We're going to embrace the practice of democracy wherever we can. We're going to use a variety of models, and we're going to learn and iterate based on what's actually working. So I'm going to close with a reminder of who is showing up in those inspiring ways that will help us get through. Who's actually modeling resistance and resilience in this acute time? People like Haniza, who we're going to hear from now.
What motivated me to start organizing is my experience as an undocumented immigrant. I know how it feels to be silenced, discriminated, and basically have your rights taken away from you. So when I got my citizenship last year, I made it my immediate goal to make sure that I use my new rights and privileges as an American to fight for a much more progressive nation. We have, as Americans, a great privilege to help everybody out as long as we use it and work together towards a common goal.
So there are millions of people around the country like Haniza in the broad sense, Move On members as well as members of many of our peer organizations like the ACLU and Color of Change and many others, who are the folks who are showing up in those inspiring ways that we need in this context of crisis, who have the power to save us from our current predicament if we support them in the ways that they deserve and need. We'll be talking here at PDF this afternoon in a workshop called Local Organizing in the Age of Mass Participation with some incredible organizers from around the country and strategists about how to extend the grassroots energy that we have seen and how to build our resilience as we do. Hope you'll join us. And just to close us, we are learning so much in this time of crisis collectively. And I'm finding real inspiration in people like Haniza and others who are stepping forward for the first time. We're learning that now more than ever, motivated Americans of all walks of life, at a mass scale, people and networks and institutions who care about preserving the equal application of the rule of law, who care about preserving and protecting our communities that are under attack, who want to work for freedom for all, who are committed to building a system that's not rigged for the few but works for the many. People are stepping up. We can support them. Civic resistance is what's going to blunt the scariest attacks of today, and democratic resilience is what's going to help us sustain this work and deepen it for the long haul to turn our country towards justice and dignity for all. Thanks.
Quick seat. So we'll get the questions up from Slido. People put in your questions, but I'm going to ask you one that may surprise you. But I'm wondering if there's anything you think we, and now I'm going to say we as in the sort of New York, we're very much a New York crowd here. We are Eastern Seaboard elite. Anything we should be doing less of because some of the polarization in this country is built by elites misbehaving too. And that I think it's fair to say, and this goes back to Haley's talk, you know, when she pointed out that upper edge of the inequality chart, that the one thing I didn't hear in your talk is, you know, what's our responsibility for this mess as well? And not just how great we are, how we're going to defeat all the bad stuff. How do we contribute to the bad stuff that we should do less of?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of pieces of answering that. I think one way I would suggest is by not giving up on anyone and taking responsibility for everyone. By which I mean the racist aunt in Wisconsin who was mentioned. We got to not give up on her. That's actually, especially if you're white, that's our responsibility.
Right, so the question I see a question that came up and a lot of people voted up is whether Move On is itself contributing to polarization or can it be a depolarizing force? I remember very early in Move On's history when Wes and Joan were running it, there was this effort to connect people, you know, to sort of figure out how you could get someone from Blue America on the phone with someone from Red America and just talk.
Yeah.
So how do you respond to that? I think there are people, and maybe some in this room, who think Move On actually contributes to polarization.
So one thing that I think is important for us to keep in mind is that sometimes people say we need a tea party on the left. And I think there is a way to argue that that would be useful. I also think it's important for us to recognize we're in a moment where there is a vast majoritarian movement that is not in control of the levers of government. And building power for that vast majoritarian movement, rather than thinking we need some fringe perspective, I think is an important place to stay grounded in. And then I think the kind of, when people talk about polarization, I think it's been so important to remember and to look back to the research by political scientists who've shown we're seeing not just polarization, but asymmetric polarization, right? The right has gone wildly off the deep end into white supremacist marches in places like Charlottesville and elsewhere. And the left is like, maybe we should have healthcare for everyone still, maybe? Like there's a false equivalence challenge that we have to avoid falling into, I think. Yeah.
Okay. One more that we have time for. This is more of an internal question, but a good accountability question for the executive director of Move On, which is, how does Move On's own legal governance structure actually and accountably share power with local networks and the people that it promotes? How does that work?
Yeah, so we do not have a voting-based structure. A lot of unions and other organizations have gone deep into democratic modes of electing leaders, and we know that that's not a silver bullet either to make an institution healthy or successful, but it can be something to play with. We've not gone that route. One thing we did do is set up an open petition platform in an effort to push out access to one of our main resources, which is our email list. So folks may not know this, but every week for our community of millions of people, an equivalent of 1 or 1.5 full base messages goes out, not from Move On's staff, but from partner organizations, often local groups, individual activists who have built themselves a chunk of our list that they're able to just talk to all they want. So we've tried different organizing strategies to push the power to access our resources out. And of course, the kind of, we will only be as healthy as we are effective at listening to, understanding the actual organizing needs of, and serving not just our members, but the broad progressive and broad, I think in this moment, to my point of my talk, civic movement in this country.
So just to clarify, Move On has a board? Move On Civic Action?
We have a tiny little board. It's got some wonderful people that you probably know on it, Ai-jen Poo, James Rucker, some other folks. We have a tiny little board, and mostly the staff is empowered to organize the members.
Yeah. Great. Well, really great to have you here, Anna. Looking forward to your afternoon workshop. Thank you.
Thank you.